Late 9th century. Rome, the eternal city, was a mosaic of history, power, and tension. At first glance, it might have seemed majestic, with its columns, temples, and palaces rising proudly above the ruins of a glorious past. Yet beneath this facade of grandeur, the city was a seething cauldron of conflicts, rivalries, and ambitions that spread through every street, square, and alleyway. The cobbled streets were narrow and winding, and the constant passage of carriages, animals, and people made every step feel like part of a chaotic, vibrant ritual. The markets were crowded, filled with mingling scents. The incense of churches competed with the smoke from ovens, the pungent smell of dung and refuse mixed with the spices and fruits brought from distant lands. Every corner seemed to tell its own story of power, betrayal, or poverty, and daily life in Rome was marked by a constant tension, as if the city itself held its breath in anticipation of the next conflict. Rome was not merely the seat of the papacy, it was the political and economic heart of a fragmented Europe. Its importance extended far beyond the spiritual. Kings, dukes, and nobles watched every papal decision closely, aware that a single decree could tip the balance of power in favor of some and against others. The Pope wielded influence not only over the faith of millions but also over territories, armies, and wealth. Spiritual authority had become a tool of political power, and whoever sat upon the chair of St. Peter had to be skillful in navigating between allies and enemies alike. The papacy was deeply entangled in the struggles of Rome's aristocratic families, each controlling specific quarters and districts. These proud and powerful lineages defended their interests with ferocity. Alliances shifted constantly, and betrayal was an ever-present threat. Assassinations and conspiracies were as common as religious rituals. Politics intertwined with faith, and temples could serve as sanctuaries or as stages for secret plots. It was within this web that Formosus was born, a shrewd, calculating, and ambitious man who rose through the ranks of the clergy to become pope in 891. Formosus understood that ruling Rome was not merely a matter of faith, it was a game of strategy, patience, and, at times, manipulation. His ascent to power had not been easy. Resentful clerics, nobles with hidden agendas, and entire factions viewed him as an obstacle to their influence. Yet his charisma, political vision, and talent for negotiation allowed him to consolidate his position, though at a cost: the accumulation of powerful enemies who observed his every move with growing mistrust. 9th century Rome was a chessboard where every move had to be calculated with precision. Every mass, every ceremony, and every papal decree was charged with tension, for the lives of leaders depended on the perception of their power and the fear they inspired. Among narrow alleys, stone palaces, and crowded squares, the air was thick with expectation and dread. The city seemed alive, aware that each day would bring new alliances, new conflicts, and new betrayals. Rome was not only politically divided, it was also marked by deep social inequalities. Merchants and craftsmen filled the markets with shouting, haggling, and barter. Beggars wandered the streets, while soldiers and guards patrolled with visible weapons and stern expressions. The contrast between wealth and poverty was stark. Lavish palaces stood beside makeshift shacks and filthy lanes. Trade was intense. Spices from the east, fine fabrics, jewels, and manuscripts arrived in the city, attracting foreign visitors who gazed upon Roman life with wonder and curiosity. Yet behind this apparent prosperity lay a constant struggle for power and influence. Every transaction, every deal, could forge either an ally or an enemy. Every visit from a foreign noble might alter internal alliances and shift the city's delicate balance. Rome was not isolated. The lingering influence of the Carolingian Empire and the presence of Viking raiders served as constant reminders that the city was under threat. The Pope had to consider not only internal factions but also how his decisions might affect European politics. Alliances with kings and foreign nobles could guarantee stability, or, conversely, provoke violent conflicts. Papal authority had to withstand both internal and external enemies, and the ability to maneuver wisely was vital for the survival of both Rome and the Pope himself. In this atmosphere, fear lurked at every corner. Rumors of conspiracies and betrayals spread quickly, breeding mistrust even among allies. Life in Rome was steeped in uncertainty. A single mistake, a misinterpreted gesture, or a controversial political choice could mean the downfall or death of a powerful figure. The city was a living organism, responsive to ambition, treachery, and the shifting tides of power. Formosus, fully aware of this reality, acted with precision. He knew he had to balance respect, fear, and loyalty, for any imbalance could prove fatal. His ability to navigate these tensions was what allowed him to consolidate his pontificate and maintain control over Rome for several years, despite the enemies that lurked in the shadows. The ascent of Formosus to the papacy in 891 was not an isolated event. Formosus to the papacy in 891 was not an isolated event. It was the outcome of years of intrigue, carefully woven alliances, and strategic maneuvers that reflected both his personal ambition and his deep understanding of Roman politics. Formosus was a man fully aware that Rome was not merely a sacred city, it was a chessboard of power where every decision, gesture, and word could mean life or death for him and for those around him. Pope Formosus had to contend not only with the clergy but also with the aristocratic families who controlled entire districts of Rome. These families, proud and often violent, pursued their own agendas and did not hesitate to interfere in papal politics if they believed their interests were threatened. To consolidate his position, Formosus had to balance respect, fear, and loyalty, a dangerous game requiring cunning and resolve. Formosus relied on his intelligence and charisma to win allies both within the clergy and among the noble families. He knew that spiritual authority alone was insufficient to maintain control, he needed political backing, financial support, and, above all, a reputation for shrewdness and decisiveness. His ability to read people, anticipate moves, and exploit existing conflicts enabled him to strengthen his position. Rome was rife with internal rivalries, but it was also full of opportunities. Formosus understood that enemies could be transformed into allies, and, when necessary, into public warnings. Every appointment of a bishop or cardinal was made with calculated precision, not merely for religious competence but also for political advantage. The choice of strategic allies consolidated his power while undermining his rivals. Moreover, Formosus was acutely aware of the influence wielded by foreign kings and nobles. His decisions resonated far beyond Rome, affecting alliances with territories of the Carolingian Empire and neighboring kingdoms. His ability to balance these external relations with internal politics was one of the keys to his success. During his pontificate, Formosus implemented reforms aimed at strengthening the Church's administration and consolidating his authority over bishops and cardinals. Though necessary for the functioning of the papacy, these reforms provoked resentment among those who saw their privileges threatened. Some clerics accused Formosus of corruption or of manipulating faith for political ends. Others viewed his actions as bold measures to stabilize a city perpetually on the brink of chaos. Rome teetered on a delicate balance between order and anarchy. Religious ceremonies were both acts of devotion and displays of power. Every mass, every blessing, and every papal decree was scrutinized by citizens, clergy, and nobles alike, who weighed the implications of each gesture. The city was charged with tension, and Formosus learned to use that pressure to his advantage, projecting authority and control. Despite his success, Formosus was never free from danger. In Rome, enemies could lurk anywhere: a seemingly loyal advisor, a resentful noble, or a cleric harboring secret ambitions. The Pope had to remain constantly vigilant, anticipating betrayal and conspiracy even in the most unexpected places. His capacity to stay composed and react swiftly proved essential to his survival. Formosus also grasped the power of perception. It was vital that both the populace and the clergy regarded his authority as legitimate and unyielding. Papal power depended as much on public image as on actual control. Every ceremony, every pronouncement, and every decree was carefully crafted to project strength and credibility. 9th century Rome was a living, perilous organism. Its streets, squares, and temples were steeped in tales of power and betrayal. The bustling markets, imposing churches, and palaces adorned with frescoes and sculptures served as the backdrop to a city where ambition and survival were inextricably intertwined. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, rumors of conspiracies spread swiftly. Mistrust seeped into every relationship, and the fear of treachery was ever present. Formosus learned to turn that tension to his advantage, projecting strength and cunning. His rise was not merely a matter of skill but of understanding the city's pulse, anticipating moves and exercising authority without ever losing sight of potential dangers. Through political shrewdness, Formosus managed to consolidate his authority for several years despite constant threats. His pontificate was defined by a delicate balance between reform and tradition, power and diplomacy. Rome appeared to obey him, though not without murmurs and resentments that grew quietly in the corridors of palaces and churches. This balance, however, was fragile. Every decision carried consequences, and the shadows of vengeance and betrayal loomed large. Formosus's enemies had not vanished, they merely waited for their moment. And that moment, years later, would alter the course of Rome's history irreversibly. The pontificate of Formosus cannot be understood without considering the wider European context. The Carolingian Empire was fractured, neighboring kingdoms sought influence over Rome, and Viking incursions threatened regional stability. Every decision made by Formosus had repercussions beyond the city: strategic alliances, interventions in external conflicts, and the management of diplomatic relations were essential to preserving papal authority. Formosus thus became a master of politics, able to balance internal and external threats, manage alliances, and consolidate a power that, in many respects, transcended the purely spiritual. His pontificate stood as an example of how ambition, intellect, and cunning could transform religious authority into tangible political power. The story of Rome in the time of Pope Formosus was not that of a city at peace. It was the story of a slumbering volcano, charged with resentment, ambition, and smouldering hatred. Every stone in its street seemed to know secrets, and every shadow concealed a whisper of betrayal. In the final years of the 9th century, Rome was far from the serene capital of Christianity. It was a political and spiritual battleground, where alliances shifted as swiftly as the winds over the Tiber. Pope Formosus had reached a perilous height. His authority was vast, his name respected, yet within the silent halls of palaces, plans were being forged that would, sooner or later, drag him to his ruin. Rome, the eternal city, never forgave the success of others. Formosus's enemies did not appear overnight. They were the fruit of years of disputes, humiliations, and papal decisions that had favored some while wounding others. In Rome, a poorly chosen word, a misjudged alliance, or an ill-advised episcopal appointment could turn into a political death sentence. Among the noble families, distrust towards the Pope was growing. The Theophylacts, the Spoleto clan, and the Lombard dukes watched with bitterness as Formosus consolidated his authority over the papal territories. They saw him as an obstacle to their ambitions. And resentment, in a divided Rome, always found an outlet. The Pope had supported certain feudal lords to the detriment of others, intervened in territorial disputes, and excommunicated those he deemed a threat to the Church. His foreign policy, pragmatic yet uncompromising, had earned him powerful enemies beyond Italy as well. Formosus was admired for his skill, but feared for his will to impose it. Meanwhile, the Carolingian Empire, once the symbol of Christian unity, was crumbling into fragments of local power. Kings and dukes fought for control of lands and titles, and Rome found itself at the center of these struggles. In northern Italy, King Lambert of Spoleto and his mother, Agiltrude, regarded Formosus as a direct enemy. The Pope had supported Arnulf of Carinthia, Lambert's rival, in crowning him Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. That decision sealed Formosus's fate. He had wagered on a foreign king to counter the power of the Spoltans, and though Arnulf briefly triumphed, his illness and retreat left Formosus vulnerable, surrounded by enemies eager for revenge. Agiltrude, a woman of fierce character and unyielding resolve, swore that the Pope would pay for his betrayal. From the walls of Spoleto, she wove a web of alliances with discontented nobles and clerics. Her political and financial influence allowed her to infiltrate her supporters into the very heart of Rome. Within the Lateran Palace, the papal seat, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The air was thick with rumor, and every ecclesiastical council meeting became a dance of wary glances. Formosus, fully aware of the looming threat, tried to maintain composure. His authority was still respected, yet fear began to seep through the corridors. The bishops and cardinals who had once supported him now hesitated. Some, fearing reprisals from the Spoltans, began to distance themselves. Others, more ambitious, saw in the growing chaos an opportunity to rise. Rome became a chessboard of espionage and treachery. Secret letters passed between nobles and prelates, oaths of loyalty were betrayed on the very night they were sworn. Loyalty was a rare commodity, and suspicion had become the city's common currency. The conspiracy against Formosus did not begin as an open assault but as a silent tide. It started with whispers, veiled accusations, murmurs about his legitimacy as pope, insinuations regarding his past decisions. Some recalled that years earlier, during the pontificate of John VIII, Formosus had been excommunicated and accused of political ambition. Though later absolved, his enemies revived those old charges to undermine his image. They claimed his ascent had been illegitimate, that he had betrayed the Church by supporting foreign monarchs. The murmurs spread, casting a growing shadow over his papacy. Formosus endured, aware that every word spoken against him was a blow to his authority. But he also knew the danger no longer lay solely outside, it had infiltrated the church itself. The city, meanwhile, seethed. The markets were filled with rumors of plots, and the clergy began to divide between supporters and opponents of the Pope. In temples, politics was discussed as fervently as faith. Masses became stages of tension, where every homily could be read as a veiled message for or against the pontiff. The people, weary of endless infighting, watched in dismay as the papacy, the supposed symbol of spiritual unity, became the very epicenter of conflict. Papal authority seemed to waver beneath the weight of intrigue. By 896, tension reached its breaking point. The Spoltan alliances strengthened, and the Pope's enemies began to move their pieces. Rome grew hostile. Messengers carrying papal orders were intercepted, and reports of betrayal multiplied. Formosus, aged and ailing, understood that his time was running out. The nights grew longer, the whispers closer. In the palace corridors, silence itself had become menacing. His closest advisers urged him to seek refuge, but the Pope refused. Rome was his duty and his damnation. His final months were marked by solitude. His letters, filled with anxiety and clarity, reveal a man acutely aware of his fate. In one, addressed to an allied bishop, he is said to have written, according to later chronicles, "Shadows do not vanish when one closes one's eyes, they only draw nearer." It was a line that encapsulated the spirit of a pontiff who realized too late that the power that had raised him was now consuming him. Formosus died on the 4th of April 896. He died in his bed, but not in peace. Rome, so often the witness to both the glory and misery of men, bid him farewell with solemn ceremony, though the air was thick with hypocrisy. His enemies attended the funeral with grave faces, some even shed false tears. His body was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, as befitted a pope. But his rest would not last. The conspiracy that had begun in life did not end with his death, it had only just begun. In the months that followed, Roman politics descended into chaos. Lambert of Spoleto, together with his mother Ageltrude, returned to Rome with a single aim, to erase the legacy of Formosus and to humiliate him even in death. From that desire was born one of the most grotesque and fascinating episodes in ecclesiastical history, the Cadaver Synod. A trial not of a living man, but of his corpse. The motives were many: revenge, power, political legitimacy, and above all, symbolism. To try the body of Formosus was to destroy not only his memory, but the very idea of an independent papal authority. It was a message to all of Rome and the Christian world: no one, not even the Pope, could defy temporal power with impunity. Preparations were made in secret, but the rumor spread. Once again, Rome was filled with whispers. It was said that the new Pope, Stephen VI, driven by Ageltrude and the Spoltans, was planning something unprecedented. Something that would stain the church forever. Beneath the cold stone of St. Peter's, the tomb of Formosus lay in silence. And silence, in Rome, always came before tragedy. Rome, 897. The city awoke beneath a heavy grey sky, as though the very heavens sensed what was about to unfold. The air was steeped in an eerie silence, not the stillness of peace, but of anticipation. Rumors rippled through the cobbled streets. Pope Stephen VI had ordered a trial, but not an ordinary one. He was to judge a dead man. That dead man was no common soul. He was Pope Formosus, the pontiff who had defied kings, forged alliances with the north, and fallen into disgrace at the hands of Italy's most powerful family, the Spoleto. After Formosus's death, Rome had descended into chaos. The nobility fought for control of the city, the clergy split into factions, and the people watched helplessly as the throne of St. Peter became a battlefield. Amidst this turmoil emerged a new pope, Stephen VI. His election was no accident. He was the perfect candidate to serve the interests of Ageltrude, widow of the Duke of Spoleto, and her son, Lambert, who sought vengeance upon Formosus for supporting their enemy, Arnulf of Carinthia. Stephen VI owed his position to them, and his loyalty was unquestionable. Yet what he was about to do surpassed all bounds of reason. It would become the most grotesque and symbolic act in the entire history of the papacy. One moonless night, under the direct orders of Pope Stephen, a group of monks and guards entered the Basilica of St. Peter. Their torches cast wavering shadows upon the marble columns. The echo of their steps filled the sacred halls. Before Formosus's tomb, they halted. One of them, trembling, broke the stone seal. The stench of death, trapped for months, escaped into the air like an ancient sigh. The body, stiff and blackened with decay, was lifted from the tomb in a mixture of horror and obedience. They dressed him once more in the papal vestments, the tiara, sandals, mantle, and golden ornaments. It was not done out of reverence, but for spectacle. Formosus had to appear once again as the Pope, even if his flesh no longer belonged to the living. Then they seated him upon a throne. His body was bound to keep him upright, the empty eye sockets, the lifeless expression, the bony hand sheathed in silk gloves. Thus prepared, he was taken to the Lateran Palace. The trial was ready to begin. The Cadaver Synod took place in the Great Hall of the Lateran Palace, the political and spiritual heart of Rome. Daylight barely filtered through the high windows, dimmed by dust hanging in the air. In the center, upon a raised platform, sat the corpse of Formosus upon his papal throne. Facing him stood Pope Stephen VI, alive, robed in the same symbols of authority. It was a vision from a nightmare, two popes, one of flesh and one of shadow, confronting each other beyond the boundaries of time. The hall was filled with spectators, bishops, nobles, soldiers, and the curious. No one spoke. Only the creak of wood and the distant whisper of the wind through the corridors could be heard. Later chroniclers would describe the scene as a collective delirium, part religious rite, part macabre spectacle. A tribunal without a soul. Stephen VI began the synod with solemnity, invoking the authority of the Church. The corpse, inert, was formally accused of violating sacred law, of having aspired to the papacy while still Bishop of Porto, of usurping the throne of St. Peter, and of performing unlawful ordinations. The charges were, of course, a farce. No one could defend the dead. No one could refute the accusations. But the ritual had to be fulfilled. To maintain the illusion of justice, a deacon was appointed as the advocate for the deceased. His task was to answer, in the corpse's name, the questions posed by the Pope. It was institutional madness. Stephen would ask, the deacon would respond, and the audience watched. Transfixed between horror and fascination. Records note that the Pope, in a fit of rage, shouted at the corpse, accusing it of heresy and treason. The body, naturally, gave no reply. Yet in that hall thick with incense and death, the silence spoke louder than words. The trial dragged on for days. During that time, Formosus's body was exposed before the assembly, slowly decaying in the heat and damp. His skin darkened, the stench grew unbearable, and still no one left. It was an act of domination, a ritual of desecration. At last, the verdict was delivered. Formosus was found guilty. All his papal acts were annulled, his appointments revoked, and his pontificate declared illegitimate. But that was not enough. The punishment had to be visible, exemplary. The guards stripped the sacred vestments from the corpse, one by one. They removed the papal ring, the symbol of his authority, and severed the 3 fingers of his right hand, with which he had bestowed blessings. The crowd looked on in silence, uncertain whether they were witnessing justice or blasphemy. Some chroniclers claim that Stephen himself, beside himself with rage, ordered the corpse to be thrown into the river Tiber. Others say it was first buried in a pauper's cemetery, only to be exhumed later and cast into the waters by night. Formosus's body vanished into the Tiber, carried away by the current. But Rome did not forget. In the days that followed, rumors spread that the corpse had reappeared, drifting back to the riverbank. Some said it had come to rest near the bridge of Sant'Angelo, and that the faithful had recognized it. Others spoke of strange lights reflected upon the water, as though the pontiff's soul demanded justice. Horrified by the sacrilege, the people began to turn against Stephen VI. What had been conceived as a display of strength became a curse. Rome began to murmur. Priests refused to say Mass in the Lateran. Nobles distanced themselves from the Pope. Fear became contagious. A few months later, the tension erupted. A popular uprising stormed the papal palace. Stephen VI was arrested, stripped of his robes, and imprisoned. The same walls that had witnessed Formosus's trial now enclosed his persecutor, awaiting judgment of his own. In August 897, Pope Stephen VI was strangled in his cell. Unlike Formosus, his body was denied honorable burial. It was cast into a common grave. Thus ended the man who had judged the dead. The Cadaver Synod left a deep scar upon the history of the Church. In the years that followed, successive popes sought to erase the event, to nullify its decrees, and to restore Formosus's reputation. His body was recovered from the Tiber and reinterred with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. But the damage had been done. The image of the papal throne was forever stained by that act of madness. The people could not forget the sight of a pope judging a corpse robed in sacred vestments. The event became a symbol of corrupted power, of faith debased by ambition. Rome, the eternal city, had witnessed how the highest spiritual authority in the world could descend into utter obscenity. After the Cadaver Synod, the papacy entered an age of unprecedented instability. In less than a decade, several popes rose and fell, many murdered or deposed. The city fractured into rival factions, and control of the Vatican became the prize in an aristocratic struggle. The memory of that macabre trial weighed upon them all. Later popes, terrified of sharing the fate of Formosus or Stephen, tried to reconcile the church with the people, but the wound was irreparable. The Cadaver Synod was a moral scar that would take centuries to heal. For many, it represented the church's ultimate corruption, a dark mirror in which it beheld itself without the mask of sanctity. With time, the story of the Cadaver Synod transcended religion. It became legend, a warning. Writers, theologians, and philosophers of later centuries evoked that trial as proof of how far the madness of power can reach. In the collective memory, the image of a corpse dressed as a pope, seated upon a throne and judged by his successors, remains one of the most powerful metaphors for human corruption. Rome, which has seen everything, still keeps the echo of that synod, the sound of footsteps on stone, the murmurs of horrified witnesses, and the silence of a corpse that spoke louder than the living. And as the Tiber continues to flow beneath its ancient bridges, some say it still carries the reflection of that condemned pontiff, drifting beneath the waters like a shadow that has never found rest. Rome, 897 AD. The echo of the trial still lingers within the stones of the Lateran Palace. The walls, blackened by candle smoke and the stench of decay, preserve the memory of the day the Church looked upon itself and saw the face of madness. The Cadaver Synod was not merely a grotesque ceremony, but an open wound in the heart of Christendom. And, as with any wound, centuries would pass before it closed. When the corpse of Formosus reappeared, floating upon the waters of the Tiber, the whole of Rome stood still. Fishermen found him silently drifting, motionless, his body astonishingly intact despite the passage of time. They drew him ashore in awe and fear. Some knelt. Others wept. For the people, this was no mere coincidence, it was a sign that the dead pope had not been a traitor, but a martyr. Rumors spread swiftly. They said the body gave off a sweet fragrance, that his severed fingers seemed whole once more, that beasts would not dare to devour him. The people began to speak of a miracle. And where there is miracle, there is faith. Within days, the corpse of Formosus had become a living relic of divine justice. The very people once forced to witness his humiliation now venerated him in secret. By night, believers gathered by the river to leave flowers, candles, and prayers. The dead had returned, and with him, Rome's conscience. Meanwhile, Pope Stephen VI lay dead in his cell. His body received no honors. His name, stained by scandal, was whispered softly, as though uttering it might summon misfortune. The clergy, bewildered, tried to erase every trace of the trial, but it was far too late. All of Europe had heard of the Cadaver Synod. Monks in the north copied its account into their chronicles. Ambassadors retold it with horror in Germanic courts. And across Christendom, kings and bishops alike wondered what Rome, the eternal city, the mother of faith, had become. The new pontiff, Romanus, tried to calm the storm. He ordered that all mention of the trial be silenced, that some of the destroyed documents be restored, and that a semblance of order be brought back. Yet his papacy lasted barely 3 months. After him came Theodore II, a man of pious and gentle spirit. Theodore commanded that the body of Formosus be recovered once more from the Tiber and buried with full papal honors. The gesture carried immense symbolic weight. It not only restored dignity to the dead but sought to cleanse the stain that had tainted the entire church. Rome breathed again, a little. But the poison was already in the Vatican's blood. In the years that followed, the subject of the trial continued to divide the clergy. Some saw Formosus as a saint and justly punished, others still regarded him as a usurper. The debate spread through monasteries and palaces alike. Meanwhile, the common people began to craft their own story. To them, the Cadaver Synod was a heavenly punishment, a reminder that no human power, however sacred it may appear, can defy death without consequence. As the decades passed, the name of Formosus became a symbol of ecclesiastical corruption. Chroniclers, poets, and heretics alike invoked it, each in their own way. Some saw it as the madness of one man, others as the reflection of an institution that had lost its path. And amidst these versions, the truth dissolved. The 10th century arrived with new popes, new intrigues, new wars. Rome sank and rose again, time after time, but the ghost of that trial never entirely vanished. Pilgrims who visited the city asked after it. Monks whispered it in the catacombs. Some said that, on stormy nights, the soul of Stephen VI still roamed the corridors of the Lateran, pursued by the shadow of Formosus. And each time the Tiber overflowed, the city felt that the dead were demanding justice. The legacy of the scandal was not merely theological, but political. The Cadaver Synod marked a breaking point between papal authority and the people's perception of it. For the first time, the figure of the Pope ceased to seem infallible. The image of that rotting body, dressed in sacred vestments, seated upon a throne before its judges, was etched forever into the collective memory as a warning against the abuse of power. For generations, the story of the trial was passed down like a dark legend. The boldest preachers used it as a moral parable: thus ends he who seeks power beyond faith. And though the Church tried to rewrite the past, it could not erase the impression that the Cadaver Synod had left upon the soul of Europe. The Middle Ages, with its blend of superstition and devotion, found in the episode a perfect metaphor: the dead Pope judged by the living one. Eternity confronting itself. The corruption of the body symbolizing the corruption of the spirit. Meanwhile, in cloisters and monasteries, the tale became forbidden. Some scribes, defying official orders, preserved copies of the trial's records. Others destroyed them for their own safety. For centuries, scholars would debate the authenticity of the event. Yet the truth is undeniable: it happened. Rome truly exhumed her dead pope, set him upon a throne, and condemned him. Time, however, softened the edges. Over the centuries, the Cadaver Synod came to be seen less as a political event and more as a symbol. The humanists of the Renaissance cited it as an example of religious excess. The Protestant reformers used it as proof of the papacy's moral decay. Even future popes would recall it with shame, as a chapter that should never have been written. And yet, the legacy of Formosus endured. Theologians of later centuries revisited his decrees, rehabilitated his memory, and recognized his virtues. In the liturgy, his name was spoken once more. And though his tomb remains silent, every stone of the basilica that shelters him seems to whisper a tale of redemption. The trial of a pope's corpse became, over time, a tragic mirror in which Rome learned to behold herself. Power, taken to its extremes, had turned the Church into its own executioner. And from that horror would arise a slow, painful reflection upon the limits of divine authority in human hands. Centuries later, when Vatican historians examine the records of 897, they find only emptiness. Dates do not match, documents are altered, witnesses vanished. But the rumor persists. Medieval chronicles recount it with a blend of horror and fascination. The corpse of Pope Formosus, enthroned, judged, and condemned, became an image that transcended time. And beyond dogma, the lesson remains that even the holiest of men may fall when power becomes an obsession. That faith, without humility, decays like an abandoned body. And that history, however unbelievable, always finds a way to repeat itself. In the centuries that followed, artists drew inspiration from the episode. Painters, writers, dramatists, all found in the Cadaver Synod an inexhaustible source of metaphor. Paintings depicted it in shadowed tones, candlelight illuminating the dead man's face while the living judges lingered in darkness. Plays portrayed it as a symbolic act of collective madness. And poets spoke of it as the moment Rome lost her innocence. In the 19th century, historians rediscovered the documents of the Synod. They called it the most macabre trial in history. Macabre trial in history. Romantic writers, fascinated by death and decay, reimagined it as a Gothic tragedy. And in the 20th century, Vatican scholars analyzed it as an institutional trauma that forever marked the relationship between spiritual and temporal power. Today, more than a millennium later, the name of Formosus still appears in the pages of history and in the conversations of those who seek to understand the limits of human power. The Cadaver Synod is no longer a mere medieval anecdote, it is an eternal warning. A parable of what happens when faith bows to vengeance, and when fear replaces reason. Rome, the eternal city, has learnt to live with her ghosts. Amidst the marble and ruins. Between temples and Vatican walls, the spirit of Formosus lingers still. Invisible. Silent. Yet ever present. Each time a pope dies, priests still whisper a prayer, one said to have been added after the scandal of 897. A short prayer, almost forgotten, yet heavy with meaning: let the dead not be judged by the living. Let the living remember that soon they too shall be dust. The Roman wind blows with the force of the past. And though time has erased many names, those of Formosus and Stephen VI still pulse within the shadows, one as the symbol of injustice suffered, the other as the warning of power unrestrained. Both bound forever by an impossible trial. The trial where faith became spectacle, where death was dragged before the courts of men, and where, for one dreadful instant, Rome gazed upon the face of her own madness. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed learning about this extraordinary event, please consider subscribing for more videos about forgotten moments in history. There are countless stories like this one, brief, fascinating, and full of lessons about power, ambition, and humanity. Until next time, I'm your narrator, and this was the Pope who was judged after death.